Alright, welcome in. I'm the Kodiak, and today I'm going to be bringing you every team's floor and ceiling in the 2024 NFL season. Before we get into it, let me take a sip out of my big cup, as we do before every video. Let me put on my chapstick. I don't know where my chapstick is. Either way, let's get right into it, and we're going to start out with the Dallas Cowboys. I have their floor at 9-8 and their ceiling at 13-4. So, with the Cowboys, head coach Mike McCarthy, this has been detrimental to this team for the past few years because McCarthy, he's a guy who can get you to the divisional round, but he can't get you any further than that. And with the loss of Dan Quinn, I don't know how this team's going to be on the defensive side of the ball because under Dan Quinn, they completely revamped their defense overnight. They were much better at taking the football away. And one of my other concerns is who steps up on offense outside of Dak Prescott and CeeDee Lamb. Because, yeah, of course, you have those two, and those two have an incredible connection. But outside of that, your skill position weapons are pretty bare. Your O-line is still kind of going through a retool, even though you did add Guyton in the first round this year. But the running back position, I'm really concerned about what their run game looks like. And I think we may see Dak throw the ball like at least 600 times this year, which would be a lot. And, oh, sorry if you guys heard that. That's my cat meowing. But, Vegas has this team at 10.5 as far as their win total, and I think that's pretty fair. I do think that CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott, they give the Cowboys a floor of 9-8, so that's even if this team is bad, even if their defense is bad. And by the way, these are all just based on the assumption that every team is going to be fully healthy because we can't predict injuries that haven't even happened yet. So this is with the intent that each team is going into the NFL season with a 100% roster that they have right now. But yeah, so I do have some questions about this Cowboys team. This team, I feel like it's less scary than I think I'm scared. I've been scared of them in the years past. So Nick Sirianni's Philadelphia Eagles. I have their floor at 10-7 and their ceiling at 13-4. And one of the things about Sirianni is that I'm not convinced he's a good coach. And Hurts, he played well last year, but he was one of the big reasons why the Eagles collapsed down the stretch is because the offense ran terrible routes and they were out of sync. And Brian Johnson, obviously, he got fired. But with Jalen Hurts, he could have done a lot better. He could have done a lot better down the stretch. And I think everybody on this team could have done better. That said, he's still one of the premier quarterback talents in the game until proven otherwise. And this team has a very strong offensive line. This team now has Saquon running behind said offensive line. And now we've got Kellen Moore, who came over from the Chargers and Cowboys. And two of those fan bases have been pretty excited to see him go. Which, I mean, just based on his reputation alone, I was expecting a lot bigger things from Kellen Moore when he was with those two teams. But regardless, now they have Vic Fangio as their defensive coordinator, and Vic Fangio's scheme relies heavily on the four guys up front being able to create pressure. Luckily, there's pretty much no better team in the NFL consistently year in and year out at creating pressure than the Philadelphia Eagles and just having an arsenal of pass rushers. So it'll be good for their front four to just get after the quarterback so that their young secondary can get to work. And so, yeah, I do think this team is a value because I have their floor at 10-7 and I have their over-under at 10.5. Or Vegas has their over-under at 10.5. So with the Commanders, I have their floor at 4-13, which is what they finished with last year. And I have their ceiling at 9-8. So that's like if everything goes well. That's the best case scenario with this team. But either way, they're going to be starting Jaden Daniels all year long, and I think the only way they really hit that ceiling is if Jaden Daniels is just somehow much better than we all expected him to be. But this is a team being coached by Cliff Kingsbury on the offensive side of the ball. Their offensive line is still pretty terrible and going through a retool, and Joe Witt Jr. is their defensive coordinator. Now, I'm not going to lie, since Dan Quinn is going to be running the defense, I don't even know who that is, but with the Commanders, you just kind of have to write out the early bumps. Like, they added a lot to their roster, and Adam Peters, it was very symbolized by what he did in free agency, adding, I'm pretty sure they made the most acquisitions of any team. Not big acquisitions, but just most overall, which symbolizes that Peters absolutely hated the roster he got. they're still kind of going through a culture rebuild from Dan Snyder's days and, having the lame duck of Ron Rivera. But yeah, so my expectations aren't high if I'm cheering for the Commanders this year, but ultimately, they could be pretty decent. They could be pretty decent, and they could play spoiler for the Giants or the Cowboys and Eagles heading into next year. Let me take a sip of water. Okay, New York Giants floor 5-12, ceiling 8-9. Now you're probably asking me, okay, why is the Giants floor 5-12 when last year they had one of the worst offenses in the history of their organization and they finished 6-11? Well, plain and simple, Tommy DeVito came in and played better than Daniel Jones. That's my just answer to that question. Dable, I'm not really sure what to think of him as a head coach because, yes, he did get the Giants to the playoffs in year one, and I was like, dang, Dable's kind of him. But last year, regression hit them like a truck. Like, not only were they losing games, they were getting blown out left and right. And Daniel Jones, he's not a good quarterback. Their offensive line, yes, they have Andrew Thomas, but still needs a lot of help up front. And the defense is something that I could see kind of keeping this team apart. And honestly, it's why I don't think this team is going to be one of the worst teams in the league because a front line, you have Lawrence and Burns and Thibodeau on the front line, along with Okereke and Banks. So they have a lot of pieces on the defensive side of the ball that I really like. And it is going to give some leeway to their offense, at least at first. But yeah, their over-under is 6.5. And honestly, I would probably go with the under. But I don't know. That feels about right. So yeah, I think the defense, if the Giants have any shot of hitting their ceiling, their defense is going to have to step up and carry the team. So Buffalo Bills. Now, this is another one where you're probably surprised. I actually have it pretty narrow as far as the range of outcomes, just because I think this team has gotten worse everywhere. They've shadowed a lot of their defensive core. They lost all those savvy defensive veterans because that unit was aging. What else? I'm trying to think of what else I wanted to bring up, but regardless. Oh, yes. So they lost Stephon Diggs, and I don't think that was as big of a loss as people want to talk about because Joe Brady came in, and as soon as Joe Brady came in, the offense ran through Josh Allen and James Cook. And that's something that's kind of unfamiliar to the Buffalo Bills. Like, ever since Josh Allen has been the quarterback of the Buffalo Bills, they have really, really not had any sort of run game, at least consistently, especially late in the year. But James Cook usage was pretty good and probably, saved the Bills season, if I'm being honest, because at one point they were below 500 in December, November last year, which was bad for them. But still, Josh Allen behind PFF's 8th ranked offensive line. I don't know why, but I don't have anything to back this up. But I feel like that feels pretty high just based on what we've seen over the past few years. But they do have a lot of continuity at that position, or at that group. So yeah, and this is one where I do think it could be a value to go under, just because I just don't know how to feel about the Buffalo Bills. I feel like their roster has gotten worse, and whenever a team's roster gets worse, it can raise the semblance of guys around them, and it can raise the job of the coaching staff. But I haven't seen anything from McDermott that enables that thought process that would make me feel good about that. And I feel really uneasy about McDermott's late game coaching, especially ones that are late into the year. And because this team has shown a propensity to collapse over and over again. So yeah, I don't know why I have 4 in front of the Dolphins, but yeah. So my floor for the Dolphins is not 7-11. It's 7-10. Hold on, let me fix that real quick. I'm just going to make this a lot more aesthetic. So, yeah. Oh, now you guys are seeing my whole Google Drive, and I just spoiled the next one for you. But, yeah. So, here we go. So, the Dolphins. I have their floor, like, worst case scenario. This is absolute worst case scenario for the team at 7-10. And I have their ceiling at 11-6. So, this team plays in a pretty tough AFC. That's why I have their floor lower than other teams that could be in the same tier as the Miami Dolphins. So we have Mike McDaniel, and Tua, just, man, I don't know what it is about him. He's good. Don't get me wrong, he is good. on random Sundays in September and October. He looks like a top 5 quarterback in the league, legitimately. But he's not good late in the year. He's not good in cold weather. And if this team can avoid the Arctic conditions, I could see them doing really good things. But they did lose their defensive coordinator. So Anthony Weaver is now taking the reins. And PFF offensive line 19th. Again, that feels pretty generous based on what we've seen. But there are some questions I have about the Miami Dolphins. I think they are going to have an explosive passing game. They're going to have a great run game, obviously, with Etienne and Mostert and adding Jalen Wright. Jalen Wright, oh my God, such a Dolphins addition. But I don't really know what to think of this team. This is kind of one of those teams where it wouldn't surprise me if they hit their floor. It wouldn't surprise me if they hit their ceiling. But there should theoretically be nowhere to go but up for the Miami Dolphins. But I don't know. McDaniel could be on the hot seat if they come up short again this year. And by come up short, I mean go into the wild card game and not look that great. So with the Patriots, I have their floor actually kind of raised. And the reason I have their floor pretty raised is because I really like what this team has done, and they do have a lot of continuity on the defensive side of the ball, especially with Gerard Mayo. He got the chance to learn from Belichick and take the reins, and I think Brissett and the idea of having him as your starter for a little bit, it does raise the floor, because as good as I think May is going to be, we don't really know what he is yet in the NFL, and we don't know when he's going to get game action, so it could be week 5, week 6, even though I think that he's too talented to keep off the field, and I do see game action sooner rather than later. But team's offensive line, still not that great of a unit, ranked by PFF as 28th. I know they just extended Onwenu, but, we still have questions there. But if there's one thing that encourages me about the Patriots, it's that they are leaving everything regarding offensive philosophy in the past few years. They are leaving all that behind. They've completely revamped their skill position players. They've, obviously they went for Drake May in the draft, but they doubled down on adding Jalen Polk and adding Javon Baker. So yeah, to go along with Kendrick Bourne and Pop Douglas and Ramondre Stevenson. So I'm kind of in on New England and what they offer in the year 2024. It's kind of a mixed bag as to what they can become, but Vegas has them as 9.5. And I don't think that's completely outrageous. But yeah, so the New York Jets, and the reason this team's floor is so low is because, and the ceiling is so low, is because why are we expecting 40-year-old Aaron Rodgers to come back and be literally anything? If he can be like a fraction of what he used to be, I think you should be very happy with that as the New York Jets. But regardless, the Jets are completely tripping over themselves and catering to Aaron Rodgers' demands. And I don't know. It's going to be another tough year. But, luckily for the Jets, that defense, we know it's nasty. We know it's absolutely disgusting. Ran by Robert Saleh and their defensive coordinator, Jeff Ulbrich. I was actually surprised that he didn't get any considerations for coaching. Then again, I don't know. People might just see Jets and be like, why would we want Stafford from the Jets? But I don't know. I think he should have at least gotten interviews. But yeah, this team's Vegas over-under is 9.5 with a lot of juice on the over. I think it's like minus 160 for the over. I think that's completely laughable. As much as PFF's offensive line ranked 5th, PFF's offensive line ranking being 5th, for this New York Jets team. Like, listen, they have no depth, and they added some veterans, yeah, but it's kind of a mix of old and young, and they need to have some cohesion before we rank them in the top 5, let alone, like, the top 15 based on how bad they've been over the past few years. But outside of Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson, this team has offered virtually nothing on offense. They haven't had a legit wide receiver, too. They haven't had anybody step up behind Breece Hall, so he was getting 25, 30 touches a game, and Breece Hall is the only guy that has proven to be situation proof. I think Garrett Wilson can be a great receiver in this league, but once again, I'm just not in on the Jets. I expect again, but their offense, it's going to let them down just like it does. And when it's Randy, who is coming off an Achilles tear and being coached Hackett and Todd Downing, oh man. All right. Well, you get what you sign up for, I guess. So with the 49ers, 11.5 is their win total. And, this is a team that has a stacked roster, but unfortunately, is not as stout as we've been used to seeing years. Yes, I know Trent Williams is, a god amongst football men, but outside of that, they've really struggled. They really struggled last year, and if Purdy has a second longer in the Super Bowl, then we're probably talking about a different outcome. And Kyle Shanahan is one of the game's premier offensive coaches. He's one of the game's premier head coaches in general. But at the same time, this 49ers team, has really, really let us down a lot lately. They've really let us down in big games. Kyle Shanahan has let us down in big games just due to the fact that he blew 28-3. He blew the Super Bowl against the Chiefs the first time. He blew the Super Bowl a second time against the Chiefs. And I don't know. There's some other stuff like the NFC Championship against the Rams that they probably should have won. But yeah. So the biggest X factor is not the regular season. The regular season is irrelevant. We know the 49ers are going to be strong. We know that they're going to be minimum a top 3 seed in the NFC, and provided the Rams don't have some crazy year, the Rams, Seahawks, or Cardinals don't have some crazy year to the point where they can take the NFC West crown away from the 49ers, because I know that does happen in tough divisions from time to time. But this team, philosophically, is pretty good, and they are built to play with the lead. So we'll see how everything goes. Brock Purdy, I still think, is one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, despite everything you hear about supporting cast and all that. Because if Brock Purdy's doing this now, why couldn't Jimmy Garoppolo? Why couldn't Trey Lance? Even though I know Lance didn't really get that much of a shot, but you know what I mean. So, yeah. Now, with the Rams, the only thing I'm concerned about is how much longer for Matt Stafford. How much longer? Because Stafford could be on borrowed time. We already know he had those issues with the elbow in the offseason the year before. So it wouldn't surprise me if this year or next year is his last. But Stafford is an incredible player. He's perennially underrated. No matter how highly you view Matt Stafford, I guarantee it's not high enough. And this team's offensive line, 16th ranked, but they were pretty good in run blocking last year. And this team's running game should be good again with Kyren Williams, and adding another Kyren Williams, who a lot of people say is arguably a better pure runner in Blake Corum. And as far as losing Raheem Morris, I mean, that's tough, but Chris Shula should provide some greatness and continuity for the Rams. I actually think their defense is going to take a step back with no Aaron Donald, but they did add Fisk and they did add Verse to kind of go away with that. And their over-under is 8.5. I'm not really buying that unless Vegas thinks the Rams defense is just going to be that much worse. I think that's a little disrespectful. I think minimum, I would have it at least 9.5, if not 10.5, because this team is consistently one of the best teams in the league. Even though they had a tough year in 2022, this team is consistently always up there as one of the toughest to play against. Sean McVay, one of the great head coaches in this league. Les Snead, one of the great GMs. And this team also has really, really good propensity to find late round gems in the draft. So yeah, Seattle Seahawks. Now, my thing is, how fast does the defense adapt to Mike Macdonald? Because if Mike Macdonald can get this defense playing at, a top 15, top 10 level, I'm really encouraged, because Geno Smith had a good year last year. The rest of the Seahawks offense did not, though. And they lost some really important games down the stretch. But yeah, so I'm really interested to see how this offense looks with Grubb, because it's a crowded team. It's a very crowded team. And the Seahawks were good at generating pressure last year. I believe they were 11th in sacks. And they added, obviously, they have Williams, and they added Murphy in the draft. So I'm excited to see what they can do. Mafe is another guy who could take a step forward. But the one question we have always with the Seahawks, it's not a Seahawks video without mentioning this, but their offensive line is ranked 31st. And I know they have guys like Lucas and Cross. I do believe they lost Lewis, but I don't know. Didn't he go to Carolina? I don't know. But yeah, so Lucas and Cross on that offensive line should be good bookends, but we're still waiting for those guys to show what they're truly capable of. But Mike Macdonald, paired up with Witherspoon and Woolen is why I have this team's ceiling as high as it is. So, Arizona Cardinals. This team last year, they finished 4-13, but they were painful to play against. I think Gannon is a great coach. I think I completely disrespected him. I thought the Cardinals were going to be one of the worst teams in the league last year. I thought they were heading for one of the worst teams in NFL history, but Dobbs was a lot more competent than I thought, and ultimately, he did have that Linsanity run, but he really kept the Cardinals afloat. I know they beat Dallas. They had that game where they beat Dallas. And once Kyler came back, this team looked great. They had the best run game in the league when Kyler came back. And they got a couple big wins. They got that big win over the Eagles in Philly. And yeah, so with Drew Petzing being their offensive coordinator, he's got a lot of toys to play with. He's got Kyler, and Kyler's going to be throwing to not only a guy who has ascended as one of the game's premier wide receiver talents, but a guy who has ascended into one of the best tight ends in the league in Trey McBride. So yeah, one of the best wide receiver prospects of all time is now with Kyler Murray. So that's going to be fantastic. Oh, hello, Kitty. That's going to be fantastic to watch themselves. So with the Chiefs, I know that this ceiling is a little optimistic. There are a few other teams that I have with optimistic ceiling projections, and the reason I have this super optimistic ceiling projection is because, yes, I know they lost Snead, but they did keep Jones, and honestly, the pass rush is really what keeps the Chiefs' defense going. But the big reason is because they overhauled their skill position group. They added Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy, so that's going to be a lot better. At least Patrick Mahomes now is throwing to Rashee Rice, Hollywood Brown, and Xavier Worthy rather than Sky Moore and Kadarius Toney. So yeah, that's good for him. Chiefs interior offensive line is basically crumble proof. Tooney, Smith, and Humphrey is probably one of the best units in the league, but Andy Reid can coach up defensive players and offensive rookies like no other. So I'm excited to see where we go from here. Or actually, I'm not excited because I really don't like the Chiefs, but as a Broncos fan. But Spagnuolo, I'm surprised he also didn't get head coaching interviews. But yeah, so I think my ceiling might be a little too optimistic, but you never know. You never know. With the Chargers, I have their floor as 9-8 and their ceiling is 12-5. So not as big of a ceiling as maybe people were expecting since they added Herbert, but I think people really underestimate the incompetence of Brandon Staley and the rest of the Chargers' weapons last year. Because last year, Brandon Staley was obviously a horrible head coach. And last year, who do you have as your weapons? You have Quentin Johnston, you have Josh Palmer, and at least you had Ladd McConkey now. But this team, philosophically, is going to change. They want to run the ball. Kimani Vidal and who'd they add? Gus Edwards? I think they're both in for big years, especially under Greg Roman. And I know that Greg Roman is going to have this team running the ball at will. So Gus Edwards is going to, I could see him legitimately having double-digit touchdowns just like Mostert had this past year. Maybe not quite as many as Mostert, but I think he could fill in that role of like the savvy old veteran guy who just gets a bunch of touchdowns. But yeah, Herbert, once again, he's still one of the game's best quarterbacks, and just the fact that this team upgraded everywhere is kind of scary. And their over-under is 8.5. Yeah, no, that's pretty laughable in my opinion, in favor of the Chargers. So the floor for the Raiders, I think they have a pretty strong floor because their defense ended last year pretty well. But the problem is, I think they're going to be closer to their floor rather than their ceiling, because their projected QB1 is Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew. Both guys who have shown flashes of competence, but what is their ceiling? What can they really get you? Where can they get you in a stacked AFC? I'm not entirely sure. And Getsy is coming over to run the offense, and we don't really know what his offense actually looks like, considering he had to deal with Justin Fields. Water break. Considering he had to deal with Justin Fields for his tenure in Chicago. But Patrick Graham and Antonio Pierce, they had this defense playing really well at the end of last year, and it kind of turned their season around once they got rid of Josh McDaniels. But yeah, Um, but what I will say is if you do have an uncertain quarterback situation with Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew, it's about as good as you can have skill position wise in Las Vegas with Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, Michael Mayer, and you just added Brock Bowers. So it'll be interesting to see how those guys get used as well. And with the Broncos, I have their floor actually raised in comparison to some other teams. And they have a really narrow range of outcomes, in my opinion, because unfortunately, as much as I would love for the Broncos to finally just suck and be awful one year and get like a 3-14 record and have a top 3 pick and be able to select a quarterback, one, next year's quarterback class looks pretty weak. And two, Sean Payton, unfortunately, I think he raises that floor. I think the Broncos will never be bad enough to get that, no matter how bad the team is, as long as Sean Payton is their coach. It was that way in New Orleans, too. Even though I know he had Breeze for pretty much his entire time. But he went 9-8 with Bridgewater, Taysom Hill, and Ian Book as his quarterback tandem. So with the Broncos, their offensive line is supposed to be good. There's a lot of stats that do not favor their offensive line, but a lot of that was due to Russell Wilson just eating a bunch of sacks and running himself into sacks all the time. And I'm interested to see. So here's kind of a few things with the Broncos. They are rightfully projected to have a 5.5 win total. Like, rightfully. I am not disputing that whatsoever because they do have one of the least talented teams in the league and they're starting a rookie quarterback. But one of the things a few things to keep an eye on. One, Bo Nix's experience. So he's started 5 years in college. And I think if there's any rookie quarterback that could come in and, be able to adapt to what Sean Payton wants to do, it's going to be Bo Nix, who has seen just a bunch of West Coast concepts and, relies so heavily on timing within his offense. And yeah, and one of the other things is that Vance Joseph, he had their defense playing lights out at certain points last year and taking the football away at will. And he had their defense playing hard, no question. But since week 8, I believe, so week 9 through 18, the Broncos defense did play pretty well in a lot of games. And they did end up letting them down in some of their important matchups. But I'm excited to see what happens there. I think they just got better everywhere on defense, and it wasn't hard to, even though they lost Justin Simmons. But yeah, floor for this team, 6-11, ceiling 9-8. Now the Ravens. I have their floor at 10-7 and their ceiling at 14-3. So the big thing about the Ravens is that not only did they lose a bunch of guys on their offensive line, they lost Simpson and 2 others, but they also lost Mike McDonald to the Seattle Seahawks. And it'll be interesting to see what this team goes through because last year was probably their best chance under the Lamar Harbaugh era. Last year's Ravens team was absolutely incredible, and it makes me kind of sad that they didn't get what I think they could have gotten and fully deserved. But either way, John Harbaugh, one of the best coaches in the league, bar none. He's just the CEO. He's like just like his brother. Todd Monken was their offensive coordinator last year, and Todd Monken did a great job with Lamar Jackson. That offense they ran was absolutely incredible. It was very tough to stop, and Zach Orr is going to be taking the reins of the defense from Mike McDonald. So they are still pretty stacked personnel-wise. They still have Matty BK, Humphrey, Roquan, and Hamilton, and a bunch of other guys that completely run that team. And they do have a lot of veteran leadership on the defensive side of the ball. Unfortunately, I do think it's kind of in this team's identity to choke late into the year. Sorry, my cat's scratching my feet. I do think that this team, until proven otherwise, they very well could be the AFC's 49ers, which is something that's really sad to think about. But yeah, so with the Cincinnati Bengals, the floor at 9-8. So 9-8 is basically what they went last year. And oh yeah, by the way, I forgot to mention 10.5. I think I would bet the over on the Ravens. I think the juice is probably on the over for the Ravens, but yeah. And same with the Bengals, 10.5 for their over-under win total. And the X factor for the Bengals is health, because last year was about as bad a year as you could have had. Burrow was clearly not healthy when he played last year, especially early on. He was starting to get better, and then he got hurt against the Ravens on Thursday Night Football. And Zach Taylor, I don't know. Zach Taylor and Lou. So this coaching staff, I'm not sure what to think about them. Like, this is an underratedly stable franchise. What they do in a lot of cases, they uh, keep head coaches and quarterbacks for many years. Think about how many years Marvin Lewis got. Think about how many years Andy Dalton got. And Andy Dalton, like, there was a reason the Dalton line existed. And with the Cincinnati Bengals, the only thing I think keeping this team from being one of the best teams in the league is, I mean, I look at what they do have. Do they have a franchise quarterback who's probably a top 5 quarterback in the sport? Yeah. Will they have a good running game with Zach Moss and Chase Brown? Yeah. Do they have good wide receivers? Oh, yeah. Chase, Higgins, and Burton is probably one of the best top threes in the NFL. It's probably the best top 3 in the NFL. And then we get to the offensive line. Oh, yeah, I forgot to mention Gesicki. I'm not really expecting Gesicki to contribute much to the Bengals, but I know he's going to be their starting tight end, but you could do better as a starting tight end. Regardless, for the Cincinnati Bengals, what has kept them back? It's always the offensive line coming together, because whether they get, a bunch of guys up front, whether they're hurt, whether they're just not clicking as a unit like they were in Burrow's first 2 years, it's something that's always held this team back. But they do have, I'm glad they did finally add Mims. So we'll see. We'll see with the Cincinnati Bengals, because with a lot of young talent, I think a lot of their young talent on the defensive side of the ball is going to start blossoming, like Murphy and, guys like those. And I don't know. We'll see where the Cincinnati Bengals go from here. But I have their ceiling of 15-2. That's pretty optimistic, I know, but I truly believe that this might be one of the best teams in football. This probably is, in my opinion, the best team in football, which might be a little bit of a hot take. So, Cleveland Browns. The one thing we have to talk about with the Browns is Deshaun Watson toasted? And I think there's a non-zero chance that he never, ever returns to even close to the player that he once was, because this is a team with a good offensive line. This is a team that had, at least at points throughout Deshaun's tenure, had a good run game. And Nick Chubb firing on all cylinders. Unfortunately, he got hurt week 2 last year, but last year's Browns team was pretty special. Jim Schwartz had that defense playing lights out. Owusu Koramoah, Newsome, Myles Garrett, that might be one of the best defensive cores in the NFL, alongside many other fantastic and outstanding contributors. And I don't know, 8.5, okay, as an over-under, it feels right, because, there's an, like I said, is this team strong enough elsewhere? Is this team strong enough elsewhere to, keep being great, and continue and build on the success of last year and looking great on their run to the playoffs, even with Joe Flacco as their quarterback? And I think it is. Stefanski's a great coach, and I don't know. I'm interested to see how Deshaun does. I know they made some additions on the offensive side of the ball. They added Jerry Jeudy. I'm not really sure if he's going to, move the needle or anything, but Elijah Moore gets his second year with the Cleveland Browns. But David Njoku played fantastic in the back half of the year, so we'll see there. And obviously, their offensive line is great. One of the best run blocking lines in the league. Completely kicking ass up front. And Stefanski, that's what he likes to do. He likes to run the ball and play good defense. So, yeah, we'll just see how they are next year. And I think that the Browns will be pretty good. So the Steelers, I actually have a pretty narrow range of outcomes for the Steelers. And honestly, this is for no reason other than the fact that Mike Tomlin is their coach. This team is getting better. This team is getting better in many areas of their football team. Obviously, I didn't really like with the way Omar Khan was left this roster, because he was left with Kenny Pickett and just a bunch of trash from Colbert. But the Steelers' ceiling, I believe, under Tomlin is 10-7, and their floor is 7-10 under Russell Wilson. And I'm just really, really curious to see what happens with Arthur Smith, because Arthur Smith could be a good offensive play caller. The people in the desert who have been dying for a George Pickens dig route, you're finally going to get that in Arthur Smith's offense. And they did make some improvements to the offensive line. I thought the offensive line had been pretty, I don't want to say laughable over the past few years, but it definitely was not the Steelers' offensive line and what we had been used to under Mike Munchak. But Their over-under is 8.5. I think that's completely correct. That's kind of trolling Tomlin or trolling people and being like, and catering into the Tomlin meme as I am here, because they do have a pretty narrow range of outcomes, because no matter how bad or how good the team is, Tomlin is always going to, uh, Tomlin's always going to have them perform the exact same way, unless you have Ben Roethlisberger, who's in his prime. Um, but regardless, their run game I'm expecting to be much improved next year, because they did add Fatanu, they added Jones last year in the draft as well. So they did add up front to their offensive line, and I don't know, Warren Najee could be. I think we're gonna see a lot more of what we thought they could be, uh, as opposed like in Matt Canada's offense, what we thought we were getting. I think we're going to see what we thought we were getting with Warren and Najee in Arthur Smith's offense, as opposed to, a 2 yard handoff up the middle, um, under Matt Canada's offense. So yeah. Now, Detroit Lions. The one thing we have to talk about with this team is how do they bounce back from the NFC Championship game collapse? Because Dan Campbell, he is an energetic coach. He has the guys playing for each other. Him and Holmes have completely revamped the culture of the Detroit Lions and made them a place where players want to play, and made them an extremely likable team. Now, unless you're a Bears, Packers, or Vikings fan. Now, with the Lions' offensive line, first, they are the best offensive line in the league, and they have Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. But you also have Jared Goff, who has played at a very high level over the past few years, to go along with their weapons like Gibbs and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta in the passing game. And the one thing we have to, be wary of with this team is how is their defense going to play, because their secondary had a propensity to get carved up last year, especially by good wide receiver ones. So the Lions should be good again. How does this team bounce back from the NFC Championship game collapse? I'm not entirely sure, but I don't know. I don't know. Unfortunately, this team does play in a very, very tough division, and you have the Packers, who are on the up and up. You have the Vikings, who are not really on the up and up, but you also have the Bears, who are on the up and up as well. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, the Packers. So speaking of the Packers and their young offense, we have Jordan Love in his second full year starting. And one of the things that's completely underrated about Gutekunst is how he's built this team. Him and Matt LaFleur have completely revitalized the offense, and they've injected a lot of young talent into that offense over the past 3 years. Just over the past 3 years in the draft, they've added Dobbs, they've added Wicks, Watson, Reed, Musgrave, Kraft, Lloyd, and they signed Josh Jacobs as well. So the Packers, they usually go defense in free agency, but one thing I could not fathom is that they took an offensive lineman over a defensive player, and I was like, what, is the sky falling in Green Bay? But nah, Morgan was a great pick by the Packers. But anyway, so Jeff Hafley, I couldn't find anything. I literally could not find anything regarding Boston College's defense and how it was relative to the rest of the ACC. So I don't know. It's kind of a surprising hire, but then again, it's about who you know, not what you know. But when I think of premier college programs, I definitely don't think of Boston College. But this team, once again, we're in a very tough NFC North, and now we get a full year. Now we get a full year on display of Jordan Love being able to, show what he's made of. And it wouldn't surprise me if he got some MVP votes just based on how strong he ended the year last year. But yeah, I think they've done a really good job transforming the identity of this team to, dealing with Aaron Rodgers nonsense. And now now he's out. Now he's in New York, and he is the Jets' problem now. So Matt Eberflus. Matt Eberflus's Chicago Bears. I have the floor at 7-10, and I have the ceiling at 12-5. And there's one guy who this season rides on, and you know who it is. You know who this season is riding on in Chicago, and it is riding on your first overall pick in Caleb Williams. He's going to be thrown into a situation that is probably one of the best we've ever seen a first overall pick get thrown into, because he has three great receiving weapons. He has Rome Odunze, he has Keenan Allen, and he has DJ Moore, who really ascended into wide receiver one status last year, now that he was finally out of the hellhole that is Carolina. They added Darnell Wright to go along with Jenkins, and honestly, I'm expecting a lot of good things out of the Chicago Bears next year. The one concern I have is Matt Eberflus. How is he as a head coach? But trading for Montez Sweat last year, it completely revitalized the Bears defense and completely transformed their season and saved the season. So yeah, Shane Waldron is coming in, and he got a 30 touchdown season out of Geno Smith of all guys. So the sky's the limit for the Bears. I think 8.5 is a pretty reasonable floor, but I'm kind of expecting more. Uh, I'm expecting to be more towards their ceiling more than anything else. I'm thinking about 10-7, 10-7 with the Bears. So speaking of a team whose ceiling I have at 10-7, it's the Minnesota Vikings, and the reason I have this team, uh, their ceiling relatively low, even though I think their roster is pretty good and they are filling it out pretty well, is because one, you have Sam Darnold and JJ McCarthy as your quarterbacks. Now, I thought McCarthy was a bad prospect. I didn't really like him, but I do respect the fact that he's going to a place in Minnesota where you have Kevin O'Connell, and McCarthy does have NFL traits, so I do hope he develops for the Vikings' sake. But Kevin O'Connell, he has fallen under a lot of criticism for his game management with the Vikings. Not like game management, but like just the game plan. Sometimes it can look a little wonky and look a little weird, but I don't know. This team has a good offensive line. I don't really know how their run game is going to look. I know they added Aaron Jones. Hopefully he can still ball, but if not, you do have Ty Chandler as well. But the Vikings defense underwent a fantastic transformation last year. I know that they blitzed on probably like 80% of the opposing QB's dropbacks, but the one thing I'm concerned about is how does this team look different with no Cousins? Because Cousins was a great QB. He had been a great QB over the past few years. Uh, I think he did a lot better of a job of shedding his like primetime choker label. I think 7.5 is pretty reasonable, and this is more of a next year team in my opinion. So the Atlanta Falcons, speaking of the team that Cousins did go to with Raheem Morris, and the Penix pick did catch me off guard, and it wouldn't surprise me just based on the fact that they used 8th overall capital on Penix if he does get his chance, in a couple games this year. Maybe, I mean, I don't know. Maybe Cousins, he's not fully recovered from his Achilles injury, which that is a possibility, and maybe they do need someone else to take the reins. Maybe is Cousins going to be ready to start week 1? I mean, I think so, but I haven't heard much about it. But either way, Falcons, good offensive line, especially with Lindstrom, and I know McGarry has fallen under flack, but I do think that team's offensive line is still going to be pretty good. And the one thing we have to keep in mind with the Atlanta Falcons is, one, they play in a weak division, but can their weapons finally be fully utilized? Because they've spent high capital on Kyle Pitts, Drake London, and Bijan Robinson and had virtually nothing to show for it. 7-10, pretty much Arthur Smith's 3 years in Atlanta. I'm pretty sure they finished 7-10 again last year. Oh yeah, they did. I have it there. Why didn't I just look there? But yeah, their over-under is 9.5, and that's pretty reasonable. They don't play in a strong division or anything like that, but I think I'm expecting this team to be pretty good, and I think if they're not good next year, it's a pretty big letdown, especially with Zach Robinson finally getting to pair up with Kirk Cousins and potentially Michael Penix. But even though I hated Penix as a prospect, I think, he decently fits with what the Falcons want to do in their direction. And, the pick was still a little baffling to me, as I've talked about, but I don't know. I'm expecting this team to be pretty good, as I'm also expecting the Bucs to be pretty good. So with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, floor I have at 7-10, ceiling I have at 11-6. So obviously Baker Mayfield is their projected QB1, and he had a great year last year. I hope he can build on it, and I hope that the loss of Canales is not that substantial, and I think that with Liam Cohen it is going to be mitigated, because Cohen's a smart cookie. He's a great guy, and I'm excited that he finally has a chance to run this Tampa Bay offense. But one thing that's interesting about Tampa Bay is that they literally don't have a defensive coordinator list on their staff, so I'm just going to assume that's Todd Bowles, even though he is the coach. But this team, Barton was one of the safest players in the draft, so they went ahead and scooped him up because they did need a center. Center was a huge question mark. And one of the things I'm wondering about with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is, can they finally establish a run game? Because Rachaad White, he's a good running back, but I don't know why, but Tampa Bay, it seems like over the past few years, they've barely, if any, if ever, had like good running backs or good running games. I know that they had Rojo and Leonard Fournette, who had those incredible playoff runs, but still, I just inconsistent at best. And I don't know, 7.5 for their over under. I think because of how weak the division is, I don't think that's going to be. I don't think I would have them at least at 8.5. Even if I was a conservative Vegas odds maker, I would have them at least 8.5. But yeah, and one thing with the Bucks is we know that the secondary is going to ball out. We know that Levante David and is going to ball out, and Vita Vea and all those guys are going to ball out. But how is their edge play? How are they going to get after the quarterback? So the New Orleans Saints, I am not optimistic about this team whatsoever. This is actually one of the lowest ceilings I have in the entire slideshow and video. But you know, those other teams that are low, you know who they are. They're the Jets, the Giants, and the Broncos, the teams you can typically expect to be the bottom feeders in the NFL. But with the Saints, I think this team is completely on the brink of collapse and just blowing it up and firing everybody and firing Loomis and firing Allen and getting everybody out of there. You have Derek Carr. He looked awful last year. There's no other way to put it. He looked like he was not even close to being worth his contract. Luckily, if there is a place where a quarterback with a bad contract can succeed, it is the Saints because you have Olave, you have Shaheed. Kamara has still been all right over the past year or so. You still have Jawan Johnson, and you do have guys like Means and A.T. Perry, who I do like, but ultimately, I'm really, really unoptimistic about what this team looks like because you're pairing Carr with the worst offensive line in the league, according to PFF. I know they have McCoy, but they're probably not going to have Ramczyk for the full year. I know they had a Fuaga as well, but I don't know. I'm still extremely scared. But Clint Kubiak, we'll see what he brings over. We'll see if a Kubiak-style offense is going to make the Saints, do well. It's going to, invigorate some life into what they're doing because long gone are the days of Joe Lombardi and Pete Carmichael being the offensive coordinators for the Saints. So, yeah, and then Joe Woods, even though I think Dennis Allen's going to be the one running the defense. But, yeah. So this is probably a team that should have, completely torn it down after Sean Payton had left. But I think with kicking the can down the road and not having any financial flexibility, this is pretty much where you're going to end up. And with the Panthers, this is another team with a very low ceiling, in my opinion. And I think that Dave Canales could be a good head coach for this team because if there's one guy who was available that you needed to reignite Bryce Young and completely wash away all the faults of the rookie season that he had, it probably was Canales. I know that Johnson interviewed with the Commanders, but he didn't end up going there. But Canales is probably the second best guy you could have gotten from anyone even available in this hiring cycle. But the Panthers, they did make improvements to their offensive line. They signed Hunt and Lewis, and I know that Ejiro Evero is one of the best defensive coordinators, in my opinion, in the league, which is crazy to say considering he's on Carolina. But Carolina's pass defense last year was pretty good. Granted, if teams are up on you like they pretty much were up on the Carolina Panthers all year, then yeah, it's pretty easy to play the pass. But still, they have a very respectable secondary, although they did get rid of Brian Burns. But I don't know. Tepper's kind of running this team into the ground, and 5.5 is a relatively reasonable Vegas over-under. And the X factor, so I know that you're probably looking at that and being like, what the heck? I just forgot to change that. I'm not even going to lie to you. So do the Cowboys throw the ball 600 times this season? That's not what we're talking about, the Panthers. The X factor for the Panthers is Bryce Young and how he is going to improve and what it looks like, going forward next year. Because Young's improvement is going to be a huge gauge as to where this franchise is. If he has another tough season, this franchise is in the torpedo and they're the new Browns. But yeah, So, last division we have is the Texans. We're going with the floor at 10-7, the ceiling at 13-4. D'Amico Ryans is a great head coach. He's one of the ascending head coaches in the NFL now, and pairing him up with Bobby Slowick has done wonders for this Texans passing offense. Because you have C.J. Stroud and you have him throwing to Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Dalton Schultz, and now Stephon Diggs. Even though I think people need to temper their expectations on Diggs a little bit. Oh yeah, and the Vegas over/under is 9.5 as well. But this team's offensive line was ranked as 22nd, and Matt Burke is their defensive coordinator, even though Ryans is going to be running the defense. But with this team, I think they added a lot in the draft, and they were kind of bare on talent and defense in general. But the fact that Ryans had them playing as well as they did symbolizes a lot. And Stroud, he has been great. He has been great so far in his NFL career, and now he's one of the premier young rookie quarterbacks in the NFL. So we'll see where he goes from here. I'm interested to see what this run game looks like with Mixon, and I know they don't really have a lot behind him either. They have Jordan, and I think they still have Dameon Pierce, but he's kind of been phased out. But regardless, this is another team that should be pretty good next year. I don't know what I really expect of them, where they fall to finish with this floor within this floor and ceiling range, because I know I have a record in my head for pretty much every team and what I think they're going to actually be as opposed to a floor and ceiling, but I don't know. So with the Indianapolis Colts, speaking of another team with floor, I have the floor for the Colts one game under the Texans, and you're probably just like, what? How could that be? Because Gus Bradley has been the worst defensive coordinator in the league over the past few years that still has a job. But Shane Steichen and Anthony Richardson, this is a match made in heaven, running behind a good offensive line with Jonathan Taylor as your running back. I'm really, really excited about the Colts, the Indianapolis Colts, and what they can do next year. AR-15, throwing to Pittman, throwing to Downs, throwing to A.D. Mitchell. It's going to be fantastic, boys. Wheels up on the Indianapolis Colts. And my bold prediction, obviously Anthony Richardson's my X factor, and it's not is he good, because we've seen plenty of film this year. I know we only have like a 3-4 game sample, but he looked good when he was on the field, like really good. And my bold prediction is that AR-15 gets more MVP votes than Stroud. AR-15 is absolutely unbelievable, and I'm going to be gushing over him. I've been gushing over him since he was at Florida, and I'm probably going to be doing the same with the Indianapolis Colts, because that guy is sick. That guy is absolutely incredible. So yeah, just an uber elite offensive young talent, like probably one of the talents I'd be most excited about if he was on my team. So yeah, Anthony Richardson paired up with Shane Steichen. That's why I'm really optimistic about the Colts next year. One team I'm not really that optimistic about is the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I know that they were 8-3 at the time of Lawrence's injury last year. And I know they made the playoffs the year before, but hear me out. Making the playoffs was a comically low bar to clear in 2022 when the Titans were starting Josh Dobbs in the winner-take-all game, and the Texans and Colts finished with top 5 picks. So yes, they made the playoffs, but I don't care about that. What I do care about is how this team looks going forward. And this team lost Calvin Ridley. He was a big part of their team last year, but this team, I hope they get better. I hope they get better because Trevor Lawrence, he got a hefty payday, and now it's time for him to earn that. And I do think Lawrence is a good quarterback, but at the same time, has he really lived up to what he's supposed to be? I mean, I don't know. But the X factor for the Jaguars is the skill position players, because they have Evan Ingram, who had a great year last year, Christian Kirk as well. They added Gabe Davis. But another thing with the Jaguars is that they added BTJ, and BTJ, I think, is really, really, really freaking good. But we may have to wait a little bit to see him fully unleashed, but I don't know. And whether it's Doug Peterson or Press Taylor, I don't know. I don't really know how things are going to look, especially on the offensive side of the ball. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of lukewarm on the Jaguars. Hopefully their offensive line gets better. And so the Tennessee Titans, this is the last team. Kudos to you if you made it thus far. So the Tennessee Titans, their 2023 record was 6-11. And that was kind of like a worst case scenario. They did not have a lot of talent anywhere. It seemed like oh god, you guys are gonna hate me. I'm blanking. I'm blanking on okay, Vrabel. Yeah, I was blanking on Vrabel's name for a second, but it seemed like Vrabel had kind of. It seems like something iffy is going on within the organization because not only did they fire Vrabel, but they fired their GM the year before. They fired Robinson and they replaced him with Carthen. And you know what happens when GMs come in? They clean house. And with the Tennessee Titans, they had to clean house because it was an aging, old team that had hit its ceiling in 2021. Yes, I know that their ceiling is the 1 seed in the AFC, but I don't know, they were kind of a weaker 1 seed. But regardless, I'm cautiously optimistic on the Titans, and here's why. I am not a Levis truther. I don't really like what he's shown on film at Kentucky or with Tennessee, but I'm not going to sit here and say you can't get better because, quarterbacks, evaluating quarterbacks, it's kind of, it's a lottery above anything else because sometimes you can be in love with a guy, but most of them don't work out. And the fact that they gave Levis a chance this year, I think they're doing him right by the organization because they signed Ridley, and this is something you have to do while you have a young quarterback who you're seeing if he could be the future. You have to put pieces around him, and Calvin Ridley just came over from the Jaguars. What else? They added Tony Pollard and signed Cushenberry, and um, I know they added Spears and a bunch of other guys in the year before. They added Latham as well to go alongside everything, and Skronsky the year before. So this team, it's getting better. It's getting better philosophy-wise on the offensive side of the ball. It's a forward-thinking group, finally. And now Callahan comes over from the Bengals, and, can we see a Cincinnati-style offense being run in Tennessee? Could we see, Levis succeed in something like that? And I think he could. I think 30th for their offensive line is pretty rough, considering they did go out and get Cushenberry and Latham in this draft. Cushenberry in free agency and Latham in the draft. But yeah, I think 6.5 is perfectly valid for where they're supposed to be. And this team, it does have a pretty wide range of outcomes. I'm accounting for Levis not only hitting, but him just completely bombing and being a complete disaster for the Tennessee Titans. But yeah, so that does it for me. Props to you if you've stuck around this long. Let me know if you guys are liking the long uploads. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.